Hello everyone. In today's episode, we continue our theme of Spain resurrecting the Roman Empire by looking at the mentality and the traditions of Francisco Pizarro. Now, around the same time that Cortés is wrapping up his conquest against the Aztecs, you began to hear reports of another wealthy native empire to the south. The Spanish launched a series of expeditions to assess the legitimacy of these reports, and amongst the Spaniards trying to determine if these rumors were true or not was Francisco Pizarro.
Pizarro was born in 1478 in Trujillo, Spain. Pizarro confirmed that the rumors of a wealthy empire were indeed correct, news that the Spanish Emperor Charles V would like to hear. In a report to the emperor, Pizarro wrote that the Inca were, quote, people of reason and the capacity to come to an understanding of our holy Catholic faith. The emperor granted Pizarro a royal contract, giving Pizarro the authority to add another realm to the Holy Spanish Imperium. The emperor also granted Pizarro a whole host of titles and honors that were usually given to medieval conquerors, one of which was appointing Pizarro a knight of the Order of Santiago. The Order of Santiago was a Christian militant order of knights, originally charged with protecting Christians on their pilgrimages to holy sites. Santiago was the name the Spanish gave to James the Apostle, the disciple of Jesus Christ. According to Christian mythology, Santiago was the patron saint of Spain. And according to legend, Santiago's stories began in the ancient days of Roman glory. In these days, King Herod was a man entrenched in the Roman ruling class, having grown up in Rome and established powerful friends there. The Romans had appointed King Herod to rule over the province of Judea and its neighboring realms. But these provinces were fraught with instability and violence. And therefore, King Herod sought to restore order. One way he sought to do this was to crack down on the Jesus movement. After all, this is why the Romans crucified Christ. On the one hand, the Jesus movement was a cult of weirdos who worshipped a hippie preaching peace and love and refusing to recognize Rome's imperial gods. And this is why they chose crucifixion. Crucifixion was a painful and torturous manner of execution. Crucifixion was usually chosen to send a message, to terrorize others into stopping similar acts and behaving in a similar manner. But the Jesus movement was not broken with the execution of their leader. The Roman authorities believed they still posed a threat to the security of the empire. And eventually the Apostle Paul was arrested. So too was James. But James was known for his fierce evangelical spirit. Jesus Christ gave James, along with John, the nickname Sons of Thunder because of their religious fervor. And this religious vitality is what earned James his execution. James was the first of Christ's disciples to be murdered, and this was the story of James for more than 1,000 years, until the medieval ages, where medieval authors revive and added to the story. This is essentially fan fiction which becomes official canon. Now, according to these medieval authors, they rewrote James's life. After the crucifixion of Christ, James traveled to the end of the Roman Empire, to the edge of the Roman province of Hispania. There, James experienced a vision. Mary, Mother of God, commanded him to build a Christian community in the town of Iberia Flavia. Therefore, Santiago established one of the oldest churches in the history of Christianity. After his labors were complete, James traveled to Judea to fulfill his destiny as a martyr. There, in Judea, he was beheaded. But his story did not end there. An angel appeared before James's disheartened followers. The angel instructed them to go to the coast with the decapitated remains of James, and to remember to bring his head. It was very important. Can't forget that. At the port of Joppa, a magical stone boat carried the decapitated saint and his followers away, foreshadowing the rise of the Spanish Empire. the followers sailed past the Pillars of Hercules, the so-called non-plus-ultra boundary, and they traveled forth all the way to Iberia Flavia. But before they could inter his body at its final resting place, the ruler, a pagan queen named Lupa, demanded that certain conditions must be met. If she would allow James to be interned in her realm, then his Christian followers needed to bring oxen to complete the construction of James's mausoleum. But the queen had tricks up her sleeve. These were no ordinary cattle. These were the magical and monstrous cattle that descended from the herds of Geryon. Geryon being the giant that Hercules vanquished. And said herd of cattle became the very animals that Hercules brought back to Greece to complete his labors. It was now Queen Lupa who gave the mere and lowly Christian disciples a task that only a demigod could complete. But the cunning queen left out another detail, that the mountain the cattle resided on was also the location of the gates of hell. Gates of hell that were guarded by a fierce, fire-breathing dragon. They figured that last part out pretty quickly when they entered the mountains, and they were immediately attacked by the beast. But their faith was their shield. They made the sign of the cross, and with that, the serpentine beast was sundered. The power of God was also all that was needed to tame Geryon's monstrous cattle. Things were not going according to Queen Lupa's plans. She believed these feats were impossible, that surely the dragon and the cattle would have done the disciples in, but she was wrong. Not only her plan, but apparently also her faith. The presence of the Christian disciples standing before her made her realize that their God was the correct God. She therefore permitted the internment of the decapitated saint. She chose the site of an ancient Roman temple, blessed with the presence of a statue of the ancient Roman god Janus. Janus being the god of duality, transitions, along with being the god of beginnings and endings. And as the decapitated saint entered Queen Lupa's temple, the statue of Janus disintegrated into pieces in the presence of James's remains, fitting for the Roman god of transitions, the Roman god of beginnings and endings. But Janus's end marks another transition, a transition to Christianity. Janus's powers had been usurped, and the dissolution of Janus's statue meant that it was now Christianity and God that determined what ended and what began. And in this case, this was the beginning of the Spanish Imperium. Now, James's disciples used the non-Christian, that is the pagan remains of Janus's statue, to construct a new mausoleum for the decapitated saint, as the Crusaders did when they converted the mosques of Jerusalem into Christian temples during the First Crusade. And just as how Cortez and the Spanish did with the remains of the Mexica Templo Mayor that were used to construct the Cathedral of Mexico City. Using the remains of non-Christian buildings to construct a Christian temple was a way of consecrating a space that was previously desecrated from their worldview. And there, the body of the decapitated saint rested for centuries undisturbed. Through the passage of time, Rome fell, Hispania fell, you had invaders from the north, and then by the south. It appeared as if the memory of James was almost close to being lost by time. Eventually, a hermit stumbled into the long-lost mausoleum. He had found remains that had decayed beyond recognition, but he had seen the writing that this was the tomb of the long-lost decapitated saint. After this rediscovery, the Christians began building a shrine for the headless hero. Alfonso II was the first pilgrim to this shrine. Alfonso II was the king of Asturia, a realm resisting Muslim occupation and struggling to establish a greater Christian kingdom. The Asturian kingdom would soon be repaid for Alfonso's piety. After all, Alfonso's successor, Ramiro I, found himself facing a substantially larger Moorish army. At the Battle of Clavijo, Ramiro's forces were outnumbered, outmatched, and surrounded. Ramiro I's troops were then slaughtered, his indefatigable Christian army was overran. However, before they could meet their demise, a miracle occurred. Saint James appeared, radiant, glorious, and immaculate. James rallied the Christian troops, inspiring the Christian forces. James spearheaded the counterattack. They vanquished their foes, and Alfonso's forces emerged victorious. James or Santiago acquired a new name from this legend, Matamoros, or Moor Killer. Now, all this is fiction. There is no evidence that the remains of James were ever interred in Spain. There is also no evidence that the Battle of Clavijo took place. And no, I'm not just talking about the appearance of St. James, but like all of the battle was fiction. The Battle of Clavijo and the St. James intervention were creations of the medieval Catholic Spanish imagination. It could be thought of as a type of pro-war propaganda meant to entice countless generations of young men to fight and die to create a Christian Spanish empire. To convince young men to kill other young men because they believed in a different version of the very same God. Christian myths such as these were also meant to bolster the prestige of certain rulers as the heads of dynasties favored by God, and therefore legitimized through God's miraculous interventions. Essentially, like, why didn't God favor your bloodline dynasty? Clearly, your dynasty is trash and ours is superior. Moreover, as the fame of the decapitated saint grew, so too did his shrine, and with that, the amount of pilgrimages. Christians from all over Europe traveled to the shrine of Santiago de Compostela. After all, this particular location was one of the only places outside of Italy in which one could see supposedly authentic relics of Christ's disciples. When the Christian pilgrims to the shrine of Santiago de Compostela returned to their homelands, they apparently returned with a profound connection to the militant Saint Santiago. The flow of pilgrims and crusaders reinforced a Christian narrative of a religious holy war, of the Reconquista. Indeed, Pope Alexander III officially recognized the Order of Santiago in 1175, an upgrade for an order which began as simple knights tasked with protecting pilgrims as they traveled to Santiago de Compostela. Eventually, the order also took on other functions such as assisting Christian rulers in their southern campaigns. And Pizarro brought this tradition of knightly holy war to the American hemisphere.
That is to American soil, therefore making the Spanish conquest of America a mere extension of the Reconquista. As a knight belonging to the Order of Santiago, Francisco Pizarro in America was no longer a Moor killer. In America, he was a pagan slayer, the conqueror of the Native Americans, that is the non-Christians. And just as how Santiago supposedly helped the Spanish triumph over their non-Christian enemies in Iberia, so too would Santiago help Francisco Pizarro out in his conquest of the non-Christians on American soil, in the American hemisphere. If things got rough, then hopefully these Knights of Santiago could depend once again on the intervention of St. James. That St. James would intervene to ensure Christian victory, just like how he supposedly did centuries before. James would ensure Christian victory everywhere, in the old world, but also in the new world. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you guys again soon.